Good evening, everyone. My name is Thane Rosenbaum. I'm the creative director of the Forum on Life, Culture, and Society at Touro College. And in partnership with our friends IFC Films, welcome to the FOLCS film series. Tonight's film, a new film and a wonderful documentary, MLK/FBI, which examines the comprehensive, overly extensive surveillance that the FBI conducted against Martin Luther King for, frankly, the entire career that he had as a civil rights activist. We speak very loosely and controversially nowadays about the law enforcement targeting African-American males. But I can assure you, if you see this movie, you know for sure the FBI absolutely targeted Martin Luther King in every effort to try to undermine his influence. We have an incredible guest list here of people to discuss it. First, the film's director, Sam Pollard, who is an award-winning director. Hello, Sam. We have the film's producer, Benjamin Hedin, who is also a distinguished journalist. He's written for the New Yorker and the Atlantic Monthly on issues related to civil rights and Martin Luther King. Our last guest is a good friend of FOLCS. We've seen her face before. She's been on our stage. The wondrous Annette-Gordon Reed, who is a university professor at Harvard, where she teaches history and law. And here's something that you'd never hear every day. I don't even know if it's ever happened. Her book, The Hemmingses of Monticello, which detailed the relationship of our third president, Thomas Jefferson, and one of his slaves, Sally Hemings, and the children that they had, received both the National Book Award and the Pulitzer Prize. It was just, such an influential book, and she's such a wonderful guest. So thank you, Annette, for coming back. If you're watching us tonight on Facebook Live, which our audience is very large on Facebook, welcome, thank you. We love knowing that you're with us. Like us on Facebook, leave a comment on Facebook. Come to our website at folks.org and sign up for our email list. If you have a question for Sam, Ben, or Annette, you can leave it at the Q&A box. And for those of you, some of you were given the ability to see the film early as an advanced screening. But if you haven't, don't miss this movie. You want to know the links to how to watch it, go to the chat button, and the link will take you to how you see the film. So welcome all of you. Sam, Ben, Annette, thanks so much for joining us. Sam, congratulations. Ben, congratulations. It's a wonderful film. Let's start off with, given the extensive surveillance, take us through the sealing of these documents. Why was all those years of FBI surveillance of King, why was it placed under seal to begin with? Can we understand that? I understand from the film that some of it will be released in 2027, but for 50 years, a federal judge required it be sealed. Why?
Ben, why don't you answer that?
Well, essentially to protect the interests of people who are named and, who the details of whose lives are covered in the wiretaps. I mean, obviously, it's going to remain secret for the FBI's own purposes. Through the early 70s, Hoover dies in 72. There are congressional investigations into both the FBI and the CIA. Then in the mid-1970s, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, King's organization, they file a lawsuit to seal the audio recordings, which a judge then, as you mentioned, places under seal for 50 years until the end of January 2027. All the paper, however, not the audio itself, but the summary and the transcripts of the surveillance, that has steadily trickled out through various declassifications and through Freedom of Information access requests.
So the audio, when you say that, and some people watching this, if you're of a certain age, by the way, I should just say, Sam, I'm a man of a certain age, and I also looked at the film as almost a Valentine to the civil rights era and some of the heroes that were associated with it. It really was. It had that kind of a effect on me. But it was no secret that Martin Luther King, there was some audio of him in hotel rooms having affairs with women who were not his wife. We already knew that. What was it? Who were we were protecting? The women? It's just interesting, the sealing. What was it about the audio? Was it to protect Coretta Scott King? Was it to protect Martin Luther King?
I'm not sure it was. I think Ben said it correctly. I think there are other people in Dr. King's life and his orbit that they felt that things shouldn't be revealed. And if you wait 50 years, a lot of these people have passed away.
I see.
So I think that was the rationale.
So Sam, what when we talk about, Ben talks about the trickling out, what's in the movie that is declassified, that has trickled out, that we had not known about or had not seen?
Well, the major thing is the fact that the FBI created this letter that William Sullivan wrote, basically saying that Dr. King should kill himself. The other thing that trickles out is the alleged, rape by another minister in the room next door that they had bugged. And basically the idea that Dr. King sat there and didn't do anything. That's something else that has come out.
Well, it was worse than that. The allegation is that he glanced over, watched a rape in progress, and laughed.
Yeah, but the thing to remember is that in the margins, when the FBI is reacting to it, they're acting like they were in the room. How could they? They weren't in the room. They didn't have any cameras in the room. They just had bugs in the room. So you have to take that with a grain of salt. I think the thing to remember too is that the FBI's, their mandate from wiretapping to bugging to following and investigating Dr. King was to destroy his reputation, discredit him as a civil rights activist and a civil rights leader. As A. Philip Randolph says at the very beginning of our film, the moral leader of our movement. J. Edgar Hoover, William Sullivan, other members of the FBI, their charge was to undercut that notion he was the moral leader. They were afraid also that he was going to be this new Black Messiah. Right.
Well, we're going to get back into this idea of moral leadership. Mm-hmm. And just briefly, the letter is fascinating, right? Sam or Ben, you can explain that. This is a letter as if it was written by some African American, but it's so obviously not written by an African American. And it basically advises King that we have surveillance of you in conducting marital infidelity, and that you should kill yourself in 35 days. That's the letter, right?
Well, it intimates that he should kill himself. It's basically saying, we know who you are. We know the things that you've done. You're a dishonorable human being. You have 3 days. You know what to do. I mean, it's intimating that he should kill himself. I think, this is sort of a reckoning for the FBI with our film, with Judas and the Black Messiah, with the United States versus Billie Holiday. This mythology of the FBI being the good guys has really been shown to reveal that they weren't the good guys. And I think, it's fascinating to see how this has occurred for them, looking at them in the past 4 years when, with Trump and the Trump administration, many of us on the left started to give the FBI a little bit of a pass because Trump was so bad. And if he thought the FBI was terrible, maybe they weren't so bad. But I don't think we should be fooled that the FBI, was basically, a surveillance organization whose job was to destroy anybody they thought was left of center that they felt was going to undermine their notion, I put this in quotes, American democracy.
It was interesting. One of the bombshells that I got out of the film, and Annette, maybe you can address this as a law professor, and it certainly gives you a new look of the movie Mississippi Burning. But in your film, Sam, what you're saying is that the FBI didn't make a single arrest in connection with the bombing in Birmingham of this Baptist church that killed the 4 little girls, or the 3 civil rights workers in Mississippi. Right. That they, despite the scene, the movie with Gene Hackman, that when you see
that was pure fiction thing. That was pure fiction.
And that something that you knew as well? Because the FBI in Mississippi Burning comes out as the heroes. They come down and restore order.
Well, that was one of the main complaints. It was sort of the white savior moment in the film that it had to be about them instead of the people who actually made the movement, real, and the people who suffered. Yeah, no, that was a twist that I hadn't expected when I saw it. That's the way it was going to be portrayed. But that was in order to get, they thought, white audiences to come to the movie. It had to be the story of the FBI and their goodness, as opposed to the civil rights workers.
So, Annette, tell us in terms of, you might know the answer to this. One of the things that's so interesting and refreshing about the film is that in an era now of identity politics and the loose usage of the words white supremacy, this film doesn't spend a lot of time using the word racist associated with J. Edgar Hoover. That's not what the film is saying. It doesn't even use the words in connection with that. There's all kinds of other things that Hoover seems to be interested in. Is Martin Luther a communist? Is he an agitator? Is he a subversive? Do we know whether, as the head of the FBI for all those decades, that in fact Hoover was, among other things, a racist?
Well, I mean, his actions certainly show that. He believed that Black people were second-class citizens. The very fact that he, thought that he had to destroy this person, the most dangerous person, Negro in the country. This whole notion of the fear of African Americans, and as the film points out, this whole obsession with King and sexuality grows straight out of racist tropes about Black men and sexuality. So it's not like he has to announce I'm a racist. It's just you look at all of the things that he did, the people he went after, and how he went after them, to suggest that yes, he was a white supremacist, and he believed that there was a place for Black people, and King was out of his place, and he was hoping to make other Black people, to bring them up, to take them out of the place. He believed in order, and there was a hierarchy, and Blacks should be on the bottom.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. I mean, we can't disregard the fact that this man grew up in a time of America where basically, as far as he was concerned, Black people were second-class citizens. And all of a sudden, here's this man who's galvanized people, young people, old people, Black and white people. And when you see that March on Washington, his I Have a Dream speech, that had to scare J. Edgar Hoover out of his pants, because all of a sudden, as Annette has just said, he's empowering Black people to say, we no longer want to be second-class citizens, we want to be a part of the mainstream. And as far as J. Edgar Hoover was concerned, that should not happen. That should not happen when he was surveilling, the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X. That should not happen when he was surveilling, Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton and the Black Panther Party. That should not happen when he basically, had Fred Hampton killed. That didn't happen with Harry Anslinger, taunting and trying to destroy Billie Holiday back in the late 40s because he was a member of the FBI. So we shouldn't give him a pass. The guy was a racist.
Hey, Ben, 50 years until it's unsealed, 2027. You're the producer of this film. Is there anything that you think that's in there that is going to be of extraordinary value, that you're going to call up Sam again? Hopefully you'll both be with us. And you'll say, we have to make MLK FBI Part 2, because now we see everything. Are you expecting, Annette, do you know of anything that the FBI, this is beyond the protection of privacy, that there's something else out there? And the reason I'm asking is because, everybody knows that, there was the Warren Commission after the John Kennedy assassination. Do we know how extensive the FBI investigated the assassination of Martin Luther King? The film does discuss it. Did the FBI care? Did it matter to them? Is there anything in there in that investigation that is under seal?
No, not, I believe, pertaining to King's murder. The FBI, this is a sort of interesting twist to the whole saga that we did not have a lot of screen time to devote. But, they did commence the largest manhunt in the history of the Bureau. And Ray was captured at the last second. He was boarding a plane that would take him to Holland, and from there, he was going to go to Africa, and he wouldn't have been extradited. So,
But why would this have been the biggest manhunt? You know, this is what you're saying to me is this was more than Dillinger, right?
well, it's a PR move. I mean, the threat
I
is
see.
gone. The threat is gone. They can take a deep breath and sort of clean house.
I see. So this is a way, what, as Sam said, there's no way to sugarcoat this. Even that investigation doesn't change Sam Pollard's mind to say,
No,
well,
I mean, it's a triumph of expeditious investigating, with Ray, because he'd gotten a nose job, he had forged 2 passports, he was in London, but that doesn't, the FBI doesn't get any credit.
I see.
They're not getting any points for his apprehension. It's just a coda. It's just a coda to the story.
I'm going to ask a question that in nowadays, I hope this comes out right. As we all know, there's incredible sensitivities. I'm now speaking as a Jewish American of a certain era, of a certain age. And Sam, let me tell you, I was very grateful what you said early on about Martin Luther King's relationship with Stanley Levison. We're living through an era in which there isn't much knowledge about a Black-Jewish alliance during the 1960s. I'm of a certain age, and I can tell you that I have enormous pride of the alliance between Blacks and Jews during the Civil Rights era. And nowadays, it's very confusing. Martin Luther King and Bayard Rustin were big supporters of Israel. And now we're living in an era in when, leaders of the Black Lives Matter intersectional woke movement aren't sure that Israel even has the right to exist. It's confusing. So we did an event years ago in connection with the feature film Marshall, starring the late Chadwick Boseman as Marshall. We had the entire cast and the director, Reggie Hudlin. And I said this very thing. And again, I was the oldest person on the stage, and I had a feeling, because in that film, you may remember, it's really a buddy film, a relationship between a young Marshall, Thurgood Marshall, who was then working with the Legal Defense Fund of the NAACP, and a Jewish lawyer in Connecticut. And they tried a rape case where a Black chauffeur was wrongly accused of rape. And I said, I just found that very refreshing. And no one on stage seemed to know either that this actually was a part of the civil rights story. Does anyone want to speak to this? I wondered if anyone else picked up on that, because we don't hear much about that anymore.
Well, Thane, it's become very complicated, the Jewish and Black relationship. As you well know, and I'm a child of the 60s. I was a teenager in 64. I was 18 years old when Dr. King was killed in 68. And sure, I remember, that Dr. King and the Jewish community and the Black community were very, very, they were like this.
Yeah.
They were like this, And, I think, to be honest with you, the world has changed and evolved. And a lot of the issues now facing this relation between Blacks and Jews has really been exacerbated because of the fractured sort of approach in terms of how people feel about Israel. In terms of how people see Israelis dealing with Palestinians, who we see as the Black people of Israel. Wow. So it's become very complicated. I mean, it's not something that you can tap your fingers on anymore. But there's a documentary that was just done about that relationship. That's I forget the title of it, but it just came out this last year.
Oh wow!
It talks about the Black and Jewish relationship. You should find that.
I will look for it.
I'll send you the name of the producer.
Yeah, no, I'm interested in that. Ben, Annette, do you have anything to add to that? You don't have to. I'm just curious. It struck me because you just don't see it anymore.
Well, well, as Sam said, things have gotten more complicated. There were questions about affirmative action.
Yes.
There were questions about Israel and Palestinians and so forth. There's no monolithic view anymore. And things were much clearer when you had de jure, segregation. And there were laws that you could fight against, and you could use the courts and moving in the streets to do things. The whole thing has become much more complicated now without law as the barrier. When you had that as a target, it made sense so they could work together, but then it begins to fracture and everything moves. But I get the sense in terms of voting, Blacks and Jewish people tend to vote
Yes.
the same way. So even
Yes.
if there's not this,
Right.
that things together, we still have the same interest in lots of ways.
Yes, but let's talk a little about Levinson, Stanley Levinson. One of the things that Sam points out and Ben points out in the film is that it's precisely because of his connection with the Communist Party of the United States that J. Edgar Hoover immediately associates, because of the intensity of this almost a brotherly friendship. At one point, I think, Sam, in the movie, you have a line from someone, might be Andrew Young, who says that Stanley Levinson is an unsung hero of the civil rights era. And so J. Edgar Hoover gets it in his head that because Levinson was once a party member to the Communist Party of America, obviously, so too must Martin Luther King be a Marxist, since they're buddies and they have such mutual affection. Can anyone speak to the influence? Did actually Levinson try to turn Martin Luther King into a communist? Did he succeed in any way? He may not have. Is that classified information that we're going to find out about? Because it's clearly the linchpin of the film is that this association, since we were living in an era at that time that FBI was known for two things, right? Fighting crime, G-men, and fighting communism. And if King was a communist, that would give them the legal authority to conduct all the surveillance that this film depicts.
Well, I mean, I'll answer first and they could probably jump in. But from what I've known about the relationship between Stanley Levinson and Martin Luther King, even before this film, Stanley Levinson was no longer a communist, He probably had ties with other communists. He was a former
You're
communist.
saying at the time he wasn't a communist either anymore.
Supposedly he no longer was a communist. Now, you got to remember, Hoover was thinking that he was still a communist and that, he was trying to turn Dr. King into a fellow traveler. You know that term, remember that term, a fellow traveler, And basically, as you heard in the film, there was a feeling, there was a concern that Black people more than anyone else would be susceptible to communist influence, because of what they had to face in America. I mean, this thing, just go back to Richard Wright's Native Son.
Of course.
That focuses on Bigger Thomas being sort of supported by the members of the Communist Party.
Well, in fact, in Native Son, Sam, if I remember right, his lawyer is a communist.
Exactly.
Max, I forgot Max's last name.
Yeah, he's a communist.
Max is,
So it was that feeling that, oh my God, Dr. King is associating with Stanley Levinson. But I remember when I did a documentary, I worked on a documentary about Harry Belafonte. He said the same thing that Andy Young said, that Dr. King and Stanley Levinson were really very close associates. He would start helping Dr. King write his speeches. They were really close. And the level of that closeness, as far as I'm concerned, is why Dr. King says to Bobby and John Kennedy, when they confront him about severing his relationship with Stanley Levinson, he basically lies to him. He says he will separate himself from Stanley Levinson, but he didn't.
So do we know how they continued their relationship if publicly they were not supposed to be seen together? And if J. Edgar Hoover was wiretapping all of Martin Luther King's calls? Because I found that interesting in the movie that Martin Luther King pulls like a double move. He tells the president and the attorney general, "Oh yeah, I'll sever my relationship with Stan," but he never does.
Right, Ben?
Ben, do you know?
No, I mean, well, while Kennedy is alive, they communicate through Clarence Jones, who's a mutual friend and part of this inner circle, and is featured in MLK FBI. And then after Kennedy's assassination, they essentially dispense with that facade and they go back to talking to one another, openly, regardless, even though they're both aware they're being tapped. Everything's tapped, both homes, both of their offices. And ironically, Thane, it is because of the wiretaps that we know King was resolutely anti-communist. He is heard on the phone saying that it's, at least as it's practiced in the Soviet Union, it's a kind of doomed ideology or a doomed system. Although later in his life, obviously, he comes to embrace concepts that we would recognize as democratic socialism.
Right.
Early in the 1960s, he is heard on the phone defending capitalism.
Let's talk a little about what democratic socialism, and that I was curious what you would think about in the film. You know, this triumphant moment where, you know, Lyndon Johnson and Martin Luther King are getting credit for the passage of the Civil Rights Act, their joint cooperation. There's been a number of films about that I think have been challenged by historians about that relationship and who really deserves most of the credit for that 1964 legislation. But in the film, in Sam and Ben's film, we hear that when Martin Luther King speaks out against against Vietnam, and now all of a sudden is an anti-war activist as well, obviously Lyndon Johnson is not happy, and that frays the relationship. Why is it that King did that, right? I mean, is it because he was exercising moral leadership? He just couldn't take the war? Is it because, I think it's mentioned in the film maybe, that it had to do with the war on poverty, and King figures you can't fight a war on poverty and fight a war in Vietnam. You can't spend that much money. Do you know why King does this? Because you would think strategically it just doesn't look right.
Well, the film suggests that he saw pictures, saw evidence of some of the things the effects of the war, but certainly he was concerned about all of the money that was being spent on Vietnam. I mean, he always believed that it was an economic problem as well. I mean, obviously you had to get rid of, as I said, de jure, segregation, right, and so forth. But the country had to be willing to make an investment, monetary investment, and to do something about poverty. And you couldn't do that spending the amounts of money that they were spending on the war. And it was I was a little girl then, but it was in the air, the notion, the anti-war movement was influential in lots of different ways. And there's always been this thing that Black people don't have anything to do with foreign policy, that, okay, stick to your issues, your domestic things, you're a citizen, but you don't get to talk about what's going on overseas. And I think Vietnam broke that in a lot of ways. And I think he went along with that, understanding that he had a right as a leader to speak out on issues other than just what was supposed to be the Black agenda, that a citizen, an American citizen, is concerned about all the things that affect America. So you put that together with wanting to have resources given to the war on poverty and thinking of the moral problem about Vietnam, I think he had to make a stand. He felt he had to make a stand.
Ben, I was thinking of the John F. Kennedy book that others claim he didn't actually write. Annette-Gordon Reed does deserve the Pulitzer, but I think Ted Sorensen actually wrote the book Profiles in Courage. And I'm wondering that he might have included Martin Luther King because this act of taking a position on the war might be an example of moral courage.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Again, for the reasons that I said before. Number one, it was an unpopular thing for more conservative people thought that it was treasonous, but it was also heresy in a way. This goes along with this idea of getting citizenship for Black people. What Sam and I were talking about before, having a proper place for Blacks, and he was not staying in that in any regard.
Ben, do you have anything you want to talk about that moral courage? One of the things I also want to talk about the 1964 legislation, there's a wonderful line, I don't remember who says it, Sam, but you'll tell me in a moment, where someone says, well, the Emancipation Proclamation gave African Americans their freedom, and the 1964 Civil Rights Act gave them their dignity. I don't remember who said that, you'll tell me. I love that part of the movie. But when I heard it, one of the things I thought of is, well, we spent after this summer of Black Lives Matter, the term of art, systemic racism, is repeated often. And we're being, educated slowly about its manifestations. When you think that's 1964, and someone at that point in the film says, that's where dignity is given to African Americans. And here we are, 2020, 2021, and we're now using terms of art. This is, a tough question, but I'm wondering if any of you want to speak about clearly 1964 Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act doesn't end the question. It doesn't fix things, correct?
Well, clearly, we all know that. Everybody here talking, we know that even though those are considered historic milestones, the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65, that did not wipe away, the legacy of slavery, the legacy of Jim Crow, the legacy of police brutality on Black men and women that we still face today. Because the thing to remember, Thane, the problem with America, from my perspective, is that many Americans don't want to come to grips, and understand that this country was built on the blood of enslaved people, of destroying Native people. It was built on that blood, because this is a capitalist country. And people, even if they want to admit it, they refuse to come face it. That's the stigma that we constantly face. It's amazing. Here we are in 2021. We got police officers have body cams now, and we can see them. We can see them now killing Black men, killing Black women. But how many of these people, police officers, are convicted? How many of them are put in jail? Barely any. Barely any. Why? Because the system that we live in, this government system, basically is still about whiteness, as far as I'm concerned.
Let's go back to this question of moral leadership. And I'm going to back into Thomas Jefferson on this one, Annette. I can't resist. I have Annette-Gordon Reed. A number of years ago, we did an event with Eliot Spitzer, which took place probably almost 2 years after he resigned as governor of New York. Many people remember why. He had visited prostitutes in states that were not New York, used a credit card that was not a government-issued credit card, and when it was disclosed, he resigned. There were people wondering, his wife has a grievance, but does the state of New York have a grievance that our governor would travel to Philadelphia to see a prostitute? Now, when I had him on stage, I said to him, Eliot, I think it was this was now 2008, so the state of New York was in a crisis, right? The country was in a... So I said, this must be very difficult for you. You could have been in public life at a time when we really needed you. Do you have a feeling that you're saying, give me a break? So I failed you morally, but I was really a smart governor. I would have been a great governor, and I would have really been able to help us here. And the question I asked him, I said, does the public have the right to want their political leaders to exercise both moral leadership as well as political leadership? Or should we say they're entitled to their private lives? Why am I asking? Well, it appears that a lot of this audio on King is of him with women in hotel rooms. And it must be awful for Coretta Scott King. But I'm just curious, would the Black community have, if they had known about this in the 1960s, does anyone know, would the Black community have withdrawn their support, their feelings for Martin Luther King? Would it have undermined his credibility? Clearly it did for J. Edgar Hoover, right? I think one of you said that. For him, this was an example that this man was unfit to be the Black Messiah.
Debauchery.
Yeah. He was unfit. But I wonder whether the three of you, and I'm sure you all have something to say about it, but we're living in a cancel culture. Would we have canceled Martin Luther King? And by the way, speaking of which, nowadays we've got criticisms of Thomas Jefferson. And I keep wondering, God, if Annette Reed had published her book now, as opposed to when it first came out, how would it have been received differently when we're hearing people withdrawing the name Thomas Jefferson? It's not as if it was a secret. We knew he owned slaves, but now we cancel people for it. So it's a complicated question. All three of you would be happy to hear if you have anything to say. By the way, you want to know what Eliot Spitzer said?
Yeah.
He said, hey, I know where you're going and you're not going to trick me. He said, I think the people of New York deserve to have a governor that can also exercise moral leadership.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. Eliot was my classmate at the law school. And my husband was on his finance team when he was running for governor. So yeah, but back to King. One of the things I found fascinating watching the documentary was that, you know, you've got LBJ, JFK, Hoover had his own issues, and you know, allegedly had his own issues. Where do these people get off? I mean, Lyndon Johnson said about JFK, he said, you know, said, I slept with more women by accident than he has slept with. I mean, the idea that King was doing something different from what these other men were doing at the time just struck me as, it's just pretty amazing to think of them being so self-righteous about this. As to whether or not the Black community would have abandoned him, you know, I don't know the answer to that. Some of them would, some of them wouldn't have. I mean, you say about Jefferson, after the revelations about Sally Hemings came out in 1803, he wins the presidency by a landslide, brings the House and the Senate with him. People didn't care. You know, it's a tool. Those kinds of things are tools that are used against other people. You know, ma, where's my pa, gone to the White House, ha, ha, ha. I mean, those things never work. You know, totally. People don't, if they're doing other things that were of value to people. I mean, Jefferson, you know, was Louisiana Purchase. People like that. White people like that. And they didn't care about slave owning. They didn't care about Sally Hemings. It was, he had done something for them. So the public has very often been able to make a distinction between the public life of people and their private lives. Yeah. Whether they should, you know, whether they should or not, I guess it's left up to you to decide. But I just thought the hypocrisy of it was, you know, Hoover, knowing about the Kennedys and other things that were going on in Washington, would think that King was somehow special in that regard.
Right. No, it's a really good point, right? I mean, Edgar Hoover knows that apparently Marilyn Monroe slept with both Kennedys, right? Mm-hmm. And yet that doesn't disqualify either of them. Mm-hmm. Robert F. Kennedy ends up running for the presidency a few years later. Mm-hmm. Ben, Sam, do you have any thoughts about this question of moral leadership? Because it seems to me in 2027, from what I'm listening to what you both said earlier, one of the things that's going to be released is a lot of audio of him having sex in hotel rooms. So what?
Well, my response to you thing would be, so what? I mean, in terms of his moral leadership, I think you have to sort of separate the two. I mean, basically, Dr. King morally was on the right track. He had a mission. You know, he was determined to fulfill that mission, to no longer have Black people be second-class citizens. Did he have a very complicated personal life? Obviously, he did. But did that take away from what he had to do with his comrades in arms, with his fellow travelers, his fellow soldiers, the Abernathys and the C.T. Vivians, you know, and the Y.T. Walkers and the Dorothy Cottons? No. So to me, this whole notion that, you know, his personal life sullies his reputation, I find bogus. And I find it to be the hypocrisy of Christianity in America. You know, it really is. I mean, it really is. I mean, this country, you know, Christian dogma is so outrageously hypocritical that you can't really buy into it. You really can't.
Hey, Ben, you've written a lot on King and the civil rights era. Have you, in any of these essays, articles that you've written, have you ever really spoken about the allegation of the affairs? Did it matter to you?
No, I mean, it mattered very much in making the film. Personally, I'm profoundly uninterested in King's private life. But for Sam and I, that you know, one, it was important to critically interrogate the history of fixating on Black male sexuality. Right. You know, the scholar in the film, Donna Murch in the film, says is a thread in American history, and it becomes particularly pronounced in the realm of political ambition.
Yeah, and can we just maybe talk a little about that? The film is really wonderful about talking about, we've seen this, you know, this is in To Kill a Mockingbird. It's in all kinds of culture, the idea of Black male sexual power. And that somehow this, for the FBI, was an example of Martin Luther King's dangerousness, that his marital infidelities was an example of how he was a threat because it tapped into these fears of Black male sexuality.
Which is just, go ahead, Ben.
No, I was just gonna say, I mean, you know, you go all the way back. I mean, I remember when we were on the phone and Sam told the editor to use Birth of a Nation.
Yeah.
And, you know, with the thing about 2027 is I don't think it will happen, but if King is canceled, Hoover wins. You know, that was the other troublesome thing about making this film is that, you know, the campaign is not entirely dead to discredit King. And so, you know, that was another reason where we just, you know, we wanted to be as careful as possible.
You know, Annette, before I get into another question, I did want to follow up with you, Annette. So given what you just said and what Sam and Ben said, can I just assume that you're disappointed by what we've seen over the last 6 months about renaming schools from Jefferson, statues? Is that upsetting to you, or do you understand it?
Oh, I understand it. And, you know, he said the earth belongs to the living, that every generation of people has to decide what it values, what its values are. And I think he probably understood that the slavery question, because he thought that slavery was a moral evil, even though he didn't have the discipline to do something about it himself. I don't think he would be surprised that people would, you know, recoil and say that he's not, you know, to recognize the Declaration, but at the same time to say there's a problem with slave owning. So you know, if people want to do that, I definitely understand why people take that tack. I don't agree with it in all situations, but I think it'd be much better to remind people of, say, the Jefferson Memorial, to remind people about his slave owning, remind people about Sally Hemings, remind people about all of those things, to have this discussion, because in some ways he's almost like a personification of America. The American dilemma is in him. Yeah. And we can't forget that. I mean, we'll never be able to move away from that and make that, to change the fact that this was a country, as Sam said, that was built on slavery and built upon the removal of indigenous people. And it would be nice to have sort of a Hollywood, have a better, if we could go back, it's like going back in your life and, you know, erasing all the people in the pictures that you didn't like you or who did something wrong. You're not going to change who you are by doing that. So it would be better, I think, to keep those people around and talk about them and explain why they were problematic and how they represent America in lots of ways, the beginnings of America, because it explains why we are where we are now.
Right.
You know, without that, you don't get why we're in the situation we're in.
That's a very good observation. Very good observation on that part.
Really, Annette, truly. The film actually explores this other interesting paradox. Ben, I think you somewhat touched on it when we were talking about the sexual potency of the Black male, because the paradox is that King wins the Nobel Peace Prize, right? People forget this. The movie is a wonderful reminder that he had won a Nobel Peace Prize. He's known as the man who essentially brings Gandhi's passive nonviolent resistance to the Americas, right? And applies it in a winning way. And yet the FBI calls him the most dangerous man in America. I mean, how is this guy the most dangerous man in America? There's a woman who's interviewed, just a woman on the street. She's probably from Alabama, I can't remember, Mississippi. And she says, yes, he's started all the riots. And I'm thinking, what was she looking at that came up with that conclusion? So again, it's interesting. Can any of you speak to this, again, odd paradox that the Nobel Peace Prize winner, who is having people do sit-ins at lunch counters and does not in any way permit responding to violence, being considered the most dangerous man in America?
Because even though he was a non-radical activist, he wasn't looked like that. He wasn't looked at as that from the perspective of Hoover and Sullivan and others. I mean, they saw this man as a threat. The fact that he was galvanizing crowds, doing sit-ins, going to towns like Birmingham, Albany, Georgia, even into Chicago.
And the numbers of people who are on the March on Washington must have been extraordinary in the minds of the FBI.
Yeah, so it's an absolute threat to this notion of democracy. I mean, here's in America, man. You think about it. I was watching a movie the other night with Cary Grant and John Garfield, and all I could think was, all of these sailors on this World War II ship, not one black person, not even in the pantry, the cook. The cooks were black back in World War II, but they weren't even there because it was segregated. It was segregated. The world, America's world, you looked it through the lens of whiteness. You know, it just goes back to the fact that the fear that Hoover and others had, this woman with that pamphlet, she's probably not from Alabama or Mississippi. She's probably from New Jersey or New York. You know, the fear, that's why she had this pamphlet when he was at that school.
Yeah, right, exactly. She's holding it up.
This guy is a threat. You know, he doesn't have a gun. You know, people are sitting in. But as the woman says to Dr. King in that TV show, don't you feel your peaceful protests are causing the violence in the city?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. And it's such an interesting question, right?
Yeah, and the thing that's fascinating, though, Thane, is that that's the same language we're hearing today. The Black Lives Matter people, aren't they causing the rise in the city? Because anytime you challenge the American status quo, it strikes fear in their hearts. It strikes fear.
Yeah. Do we happen to know, because the film mentions the Black Panther movement, Black Power movement, Malcolm X. Do we happen to know whether King, as you know, as the 60s continues to unfold and African Americans are starting to be exposed to alternative ways of thinking about protests and carrying on this struggle, does he ever waver in his feelings for nonviolent resistance? Do we know?
Ben's the Dr. King expert. He could probably.
And you've written about this so much. Do we know whether he was ever thinking, you know what, maybe it's time to not just do sit-ins?
No, in the historical record, there is not a single mention of his faith in nonviolence wavering.
Wow.
In fact, prior to the start of the Poor People's Campaign, he sort of waged a mock wedding where he said, "I take thee nonviolence as my lawfully wedded wife." As the decade wore on, if anything, it was the opposite.
Annette, do you know the answer to this? So the film basically shows that King is wiretapped, his phones are tapped, every hotel room that he's in, offices, there's bugs everywhere. Did Hoover have some kind of extraordinary law enforcement power to be able to do all this ongoing surveillance without court orders? Or did he have warrants, and these warrants never lapsed? They were indefinite?
You know, I don't know the answer to that. I wondered about that, and I have wondered about that. Hoover did pretty much what he wanted to do. Everybody was afraid of Hoover. So if he wanted a warrant, it wouldn't have been any problem getting one from him. But I think he did a lot of that. It appears that he did a lot of that just on his own.
I mean, it feels like the Patriot Act to me. It's like we're going off the menu, and we're just going to have a different set of rules that do not apply to Martin Luther King, but they would apply to anyone else who's getting wiretapped.
No. I was going to ask Ben about that. I mean, who did he go to? What did he do?
Well, so he does need approval from the Attorney General to wiretap.
Yeah.
And then what he would do then is negotiate and move within this gray area where permission to wiretap would also give him permission to for electronic surveillance. So for
okay.
And that
I see.
And so that's sort of how he got away with it.
Mm-hmm.
As long as the Attorney General was friendly to his mission. Though by the end of King's life, and after King and Coretta move houses in Atlanta, the surveillance does begin to taper off, and they become more reliant on human informants.
Huh. Mm-hmm. Well, the movie actually also talks about that there's also an informant that's in their office.
I thought that was fascinating that Andrew Young said I won't call names.
Yeah. Good one, Annette. I agree.
He wouldn't even say who he was.
Yeah, yeah.
Ben knows who he is.
Well, you do too. I mean, you say in the movie.
They
still see each other. I mean, yeah, James Harrison lives in Stone Mountain, Georgia, and he and Young will occasionally bump into each other.
And he was a paid informant of the FBI.
He was a paid informant. And earlier, Thane, you asked what's new in the film. I mean, something that's new is that Harrison worked for the FBI prior to moving to Atlanta. That was not known until the 2018 classification.
Wow. They had a long association with him.
So they probably sent him.
Yeah.
It wasn't recruiting somebody in Atlanta. It was.
Wow.
Do you have any idea how much money he was paid? Was this a lucrative thing? I mean, or is he a true believer on the other side? What was the motivation?
This is not fact checked, but I think it's probably $50 a week.
Wow. All right, let me get to another, what I would call complicated question, but this is FOLCS, that's what we do. Some of you, Annette and certainly Sam, have touched on this earlier. You know, as I said earlier, I said, you know, the film is very much a Valentine, in my view, to the civil rights era and some of the heroes associated with it. The Black Lives Matter movement over the last number of months has held up George Floyd, Michael Brown, and spoken them as civil rights martyrs. And again, I'm a man of a certain generation. So, you know, I revere James Meredith and, you know, Medgar Evers and Martin Luther King and Bayard Rustin. These men really matter to me. And I'm now, again, I'm exposing my white privilege. I don't feel the same way about these particular people. Is that something that is just an example of Thane Rosenbaum's horrible white privilege? Or even in your own minds, do you make distinctions between those civil rights people and those who seem to have been there, the crimes committed against them or the acts committed them seems to have mobilized this new community of activists?
I would say this thing. George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Michael Brown, they are martyrs to the struggle. Because think of it this way. They may not have been like James Meredith. They may not have been like Cheney, Shorter, and Goodman. But as soon as their bodies were attacked by white police officers, as soon as they were shot down on the streets, you know, to me, it's still what I call Americans lynching. There's no separation for me, you know, and we can't think any other way about it. Because until there's a respect for this color of our skin, my skin, these people who are killed, who are tortured, they are martyrs to the struggle.
Annette, Ben, any thoughts to add to that?
I agree with Sam.
Wow, interesting. Ben, you could now say, as another white guy, you could say that, and say I'm a little with Thane. On the other hand, you're such an expert on King. Hey, by the way, let me just ask you this question about that. In the era in which of identity politics, Ben, you know, you've written a lot, you've dedicated a lot of your professional career to the civil rights era and the study of King. Has anyone ever said, but you're a white guy?
Sure, but you know, less and less recently. You know, but I would say very quickly that it is a fallacy to think that the civil rights movement is only about Black people. You know, I mean, James Baldwin, he said, "Do I really want to be integrated into a burning house?" So it was a chance for you know, if I want to use white people, first person plural, it was a chance for us to put out the fire. And you know, so in writing about the movement, I think it's important to reckon with that. Okay.
If King were with us today and alive, imagine who he would be, what he would have been, given what he did in his short life. It's astonishing what he might have ended up doing. What do you think? Each of you have your own sort of experience, knowledge of King, writing about him, thinking about him. What would he have said to the summer that we just had? Would it be like what Sam said? I'm not surprised, I guess.
He would say, "Thane, damn it, we still have a long way to go." That's what he would say. And that's a sad statement on the state of America, man.
Which is the point you said earlier when I said, well, the movie says that 1964 Civil Rights Act was the restoring of dignity to African Americans. And you said, hey, Thane, give me a break. You know, it did not end this problem.
No, it hasn't, man. It hasn't.
Annette, Annette, Ben, also, you've written about King. Can you think of ways that he would have entered these conversations in a different way, in a helpful way? Do you think he could have, given all these decades, we just lost John Lewis, so we sort of know, John Lewis then became a congressman. He got, if I'm not mistaken, he got his head beat in Selma, so he was there on the front lines. God knows what King would have ended up. Would have there been some original wisdom that would have been?
It's a tougher situation because what he had going for him was a Cold War. America had international perceived enemies, the Soviet Union, China, group of people countries with whom they were competing for, the new emerging countries and so forth. America is the only superpower now. We don't really have, and a lot of what happened with the civil rights movement was trying to put on a good face in a situation. How could you criticize the Soviet Union and China when you had Jim Crow here in the United States of America? So the existence of an enemy, I think, helped the civil rights movement within the United States. Now we don't have that, and people have gone crazy. There is no without that external enemy, we sort of turned on ourselves. So there's a long way of saying I don't know what he would do because the circumstances are so different now, and the answers are, I think it's much tougher. It's hard to know what to do. There's no one to appeal to.
Let's take some questions from the audience and then we'll say goodnight. This comes to us from Brett Feeder. He happens to be one of our board members. Without at all disputing Hoover's overt racism or sexual perversion, hypocrisy, isn't it true that he was consumed by plain and simple self-retention of power, as evidenced by his sexual surveillance on white men of power too, such as JFK with Marilyn Monroe, even when he was the president of the United States? What about that?
I think that's true.
Mm-hmm.
I think, listen, I think you got to look at something that Annette says. Even back in the 60s, human beings were complicated. So Hoover brought a lot of baggage to the table. Here's a little man who was able to amass a lot of power. And he had, as we all know, he had files on everybody, But he decided that the person he needed to take down wasn't any of these white guys. It was a black man. It was black people. It was black organizations. That's because of his fear of the fear of black empowerment and black people being emboldened to want to say, we no longer want to be second-class citizens. So let's remember that.
This comes to us from a woman named Ruth Gold. She says, kudos on the film. What can we do to stop the Hoovers and Sullivans of today? It's interesting, the film does have James Comey in it. It was just an interesting choice of putting him in there, Sam. Does anyone have any thoughts about that?
Well, in all honesty, we would have to change this whole notion of American democracy.
Wow.
American capitalism. I'll say American capitalism. I'll use that term. We have to rethink the whole idea of American capitalism, because there's the haves and the have-nots, and that gulf is getting wider and wider and wider. Think of it this way, Thane. We have a Congress fighting over paying for our people, poor people, $15 an hour. That's embarrassing, man.
Yeah.
That's embarrassing. In 2021, people are saying people can't make $15 an hour minimum wage. That's still not enough money to live. That's embarrassing.
Yeah. Here's a complicated question, Annette, you might need to take it here because you're a lawyer. The common theme I hear, this comes from a gentleman named Keith Long. The common theme I hear from Sam is that the FBI is a political arm of the establishment, first for conservatives against Martin Luther King, and later for liberals versus Trump. So he's making the distinction that it can be used politically in both directions. And Martin Luther King and Trump can each be targets of the FBI. So then Keith Long says, so isn't the issue the politicization of our justice and law enforcement system?
Annette?
Well, I don't know. I would not see what happened to King what the FBI did to King and what the FBI, his problems with Trump are co-equal. They're not the same. It's not the same situation here. I mean, King, they went after King because King was exercising his rights as an American citizen to try to change citizenship rights for Black people. Trump, he got into problem with Trump. Trump went to war with them because he wanted to use them
as his own law enforcement.
He has his own way. So I think it's a false equivalency. That's the phrase that I'm thinking of. They're not the same. And so, yeah, sure, they could be politicized, but these are very vastly different circumstances to me.
Yeah. Ben, why don't you take this one? This comes from Jay Mendez. Is it clear that Ray acted alone in killing King?
No, it's not.
Do we know? Is there any conspiracy? Is there an Oswald conspiracy when it comes to?
This is the deepest divide between Sam and me. So,
is that right? Did you actually have a disagreement in the film over this point?
No, not really, but we disagree about it off the record and off camera. But
tell us.
I'm gonna go first, and Sam can go. So I just want to say that in my life, I've only met one other person who believes James Earl Ray killed Martin Luther King. So I'm very much in the minority here. I've been to Memphis and I've heard every conspiracy theory under the sun. So with that proviso, to me, it's an open and shut case. I mean, there's not a jot of forensic evidence that anybody else was in on it. Ray was stalking King for some time, and he got incredibly lucky. The night before the murder, he was watching TV. The local news showed King. It showed his room number. You know, he went to Memphis. He got a room in a boarding house across the street with a perfect angle at room 406, Lorraine Motel. King stepped out on the balcony. So, you know, to me, it's not even a question. I understand why the questions are raised. And again, you don't exculpate the FBI by saying James Earl Ray acted by himself. And the FBI certainly never acted in a bodyguard capacity, though King would have refused that. Mm-hmm. And they didn't pass on, as we say in the film, as Beverly Gage, Hoover's biographer, says in the film. They never passed on threats that may have been credible on his life.
So, Sam, we have to assume you are of the opinion that Ray was not the lone gunman.
Yeah, I just don't believe that James Earl Ray acted alone. It just doesn't make sense to me. I believe that there was a conspiracy either within the FBI against Dr. King or outside the FBI, but it just doesn't make sense to me. And the fact that in our film, Chuck Knox, the former FBI agent, says very clearly, every time Dr. King went to a city, the FBI was on him 24/7. They were surveilling him, they were observing him, and Ben's right. They knew about possible threats to Dr. King. They didn't take it seriously, or they did take it seriously, they didn't do anything about it, you know. So I just don't believe it, you know, that he acted alone as a lone gunman. It doesn't make any sense to me.
All right,
I will say that when he was shot, the people who were surveilling him, you know, saw it on the binoculars. You know, it's really tragic.
You're just saying that they got a perfect view of this happening.
Well, no, there were two people following him around Memphis, and they were, you know, they were across the street, and they were watching King as he was being surveilled literally the instant he died.
That's incredible. Amazing anecdote. All right, before we say goodnight, let me just have a comment from a woman named Beth Simon, who said,
Shared Legacy. She tells you the name of the film.
Yeah, did you see that? Yeah, the movie that Sam was thinking of that deals with the relationship between Blacks and Jews is Shared Legacies. The director is someone named Dr. Shari Rogers. Right. So before we say goodnight to Sam and Ben and Annette, let's just give you some quick announcements of upcoming events. You know, the film MLK FBI, we were originally going to show it in February, but we had to move it to March, but it was in connection with Black History Month. And so on Monday, this upcoming Monday, in connection with International Women's Day, the film that will be appearing, a documentary on Oprah Winfrey's network, it's called OWN, and the film is Invisible Portraits. And we have the film's director and also the head of the OWN network. And that's Monday night, March 8th. What do we have? What else is coming up? Of course, a giant fan favorite for people who come to FOLCS, our international short film competition. Films from all over the world, 20 minutes or less, in any genre: documentary, animation, comedy, drama. This is the 8th annual. We give out what's called FOLCS Awards Night. We give out an award called the FOLCSy. It's a very popular night, and we even give out an award called Audience Favorite. Because of the pandemic, we're going to do this in a very, very different way. In early April, you'll be able to watch the finalist 8 films on March 9th, which is next week, March 9th. If you go to a FOLCS website, it'll give you a list of how to participate in the festival. Awards night is going to be on April 8th at 6 p.m. I think we even have music this year. We always have a red carpet. I think we're going to try to even have a red carpet. You know, we're looking forward to this. It's really one of our favorites. So remember those dates. And on Monday, our friends at Touro College, where we are based, they have Touro Talks, a conversation with the president of Touro, Dr. Alan Kadish, and European public intellectual Bernard-Henri Lévy, who has been a former guest at FOLCS. And you can watch our conversation with Bernard-Henri Lévy on the folks.org website. That's coming up on Sunday in the morning, 10 a.m. because Bernard-Henri Lévy is French and it's the end of his day. We are, of course, a nonprofit. If you can donate to us, here's 2 ways to do it: on our website as well as the text button. Watch this film. Go to the chat button, get the link. This is a true cinematic achievement and a wonderful partnership between Ben and Sam, and just really love this film. It'll change you. You don't have to be like me, a man of a certain time. You'll learn a lot, and it's inspiring on multiple levels. I really want to thank Sam, congratulate Sam and Ben. Annette, you know I adore you. And so thank you so much for coming on our stage again, Annette. It's good seeing all 3 of you. Stay healthy.
You too.
Until next time, Thane Rosenbaum for FOLCS.
Very nice meeting you, Annette. Be good.
Nice meeting you too. Goodbye. Goodbye,
Bye.
Benjamin.
Take care, Ben.